Today, I want to speak from a place of pain, but also purpose. The title of this message might make you pause. God didn't punish you. He positioned you in the narcissist's life for a reason. If you've ever found yourself entangled with a narcissist, whether in a relationship, family, or even in the workplace, you know how draining, confusing, and damaging it can be. It's easy to wonder, why did God allow this? What did I do to deserve this pain? Let me tell you, clearly God did not punish you. In fact, He trusted you. He knew that even in the storm, your heart would still seek light. He saw your strength, your compassion, and your capacity to grow in adversity. You see, narcissists are often deeply wounded people. Master manipulators, yes, but often masking profound insecurity and brokenness. God sometimes positions people like you, empathic, strong, spiritually grounded, not to be abused, but to be a mirror, a seed planter, or a catalyst for change, even if that change isn't immediate. This doesn't mean you should stay in toxicity. God doesn't want you abused. He wants you awake. And sometimes your awakening is the first step in someone else's accountability, even if it's just your departure that finally exposes the truth. Let's not mistake a painful experience for a purposeless one. You were never alone. You were never forgotten. And even in the hardest moments, God was working behind the scenes, shaping you, refining you, and preparing you for greater. So if you're walking away from that situation bruised, confused, but breathing, know this: you're not broken. You're chosen. And the position you were in was never punishment. It was preparation. One of the most critical misunderstandings people often wrestle with during or after a traumatic experience, especially at the hands of a narcissist, is the question, did God allow this to happen to me? Why would a loving God let someone hurt me so deeply? Let's be clear, God is not the author of abuse. He does not orchestrate cruelty, manipulation, or emotional torment. These behaviors stem from broken humanity, free will, and the deeply embedded dysfunction that exists in people who often haven't dealt with their own wounds. A narcissist by nature is self-consumed, validation, hungry, and often spiritually disconnected. The pain they cause comes from their refusal to submit to truth, not from God's hand. When you're under the thumb of a narcissist, gaslit, minimized, drained, and constantly second-guessing your worth, it's easy to internalize the false belief that this suffering is somehow divine judgment. You may even start to think you're being punished for something you did, something you failed to do, or something you lack. That is a lie. God does not use abuse to teach lessons. He uses healing. He uses grace, mercy, conviction, and truth. But because we live in a fallen world where people misuse their free will, sometimes you end up in relationships and situations that are damaging, not because God wanted it, but because He knew He could use it. There is a difference. Imagine a sculptor who finds a broken, jagged stone on the side of the road. To most, it looks useless, but the sculptor sees potential, not because the damage was part of the original design, but because he knows how to redeem what others discarded. That is how God works. He picks up the pieces of what tried to destroy you and in His sovereignty turns them into something sacred. Your pain is not divine punishment. It is a canvas for divine redemption. And that's not a spiritual cliche. That is scriptural. Romans 18:28 says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him. Not some things, all things, even the things that broke your heart, shattered your trust, and drained your soul. What does that mean practically? It means that God never intended for you to be belittled, lied to, dehumanized, or manipulated. That wasn't His will for you. That was someone else choosing control over compassion. But even though the trauma wasn't God ordained, He will never waste it. He is the God of beauty for ashes. Isaiah 61:3. He steps into the ruins, not to say, I caused this, but to declare, I'm still here and I will rebuild this. Sometimes we have to unlearn bad theology that told us suffering is the price of spirituality. Yes, Jesus said we'd have tribulations, but He never told us to tolerate abuse in the name of spiritual endurance. There is a difference between trials that grow your faith and people who trample your identity. God never calls you to lose yourself in someone else's dysfunction. He calls you to find yourself in Him, even in the middle of the fire. And let's be honest, when you were walking through that narcissistic situation, it felt like hell. You might have been isolated, emotionally exhausted, and spiritually numb. But even there, especially there, God was at work, quietly, patiently redeeming what you thought was irreparable. His redemption doesn't always look like deliverance in the moment. Sometimes it's in the delay. Sometimes it's in the slow unraveling of lies you believed. Sometimes it's in the strength you didn't even know you had to finally say, enough. And sometimes the greatest miracle is not that the narcissist changed. It's that you did. You began to see differently, to pray differently, to walk differently, to rise. And all of that God wove together not to punish you, but to prepare you. When you're entangled in the emotional chaos that often surrounds a narcissistic relationship, the inner narrative becomes incredibly distorted. You begin to question your identity. You begin to doubt your discernment. You wonder, why me? Not from a place of curiosity, but from a place of despair. Why was I the one chosen to endure this pain, to carry this burden, to love someone who only ever loved themselves? The enemy takes advantage of these questions, whispering lies that say, you must be cursed. This is what you deserve. This is a consequence. But let's stop right there. Let me say this as clearly as possible. You are not cursed. You are chosen. The difference between these two perspectives is everything. A curse implies punishment, condemnation, spiritual rejection. But being chosen implies purpose, intentionality, trust. It means God saw something in you that could stand in the fire and still come out refined, not destroyed. Being chosen doesn't mean life will be easy. In fact, in Scripture, those who were chosen by God often walk through some of the most difficult, painful, and confusing seasons imaginable. Joseph was chosen and thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. Esther was chosen and had to risk her life to confront a king. Job was chosen and lost everything. Paul was chosen and suffered beatings, shipwrecks, and betrayal. Jesus himself was chosen and crucified. So understand this: being chosen does not mean being exempt from pain. It means being trusted with it. When God chose you to be in the life of a narcissist, not to be victimized, but to be a vessel, he wasn't throwing you to the wolves. He was assigning you to a battlefield with armor you didn't even know you had. He saw your resilience before you did. He knew that even in confusion, you would keep seeking him. That even in heartbreak, your spirit would not break. That even when your self-esteem was shattered by words meant to control you, your soul would still cry out for truth. Narcissists are masters of manipulation. They twist narratives. They rewrite history. They deflect blame and project shame. But what they could never do, what they can't do, is override God's anointing on your life. They might have tried to redefine who you are, but heaven never changed its mind about you. You are still chosen, chosen to discern, chosen to grow, chosen to escape, chosen to be a light, even if only for a season, chosen to show grace and eventually to set boundaries, chosen to break generational cycles, chosen to walk away stronger, wiser, and more spiritually grounded than ever before. You may ask, but why would God choose me to endure such emotional abuse? That's a fair question, and the answer lies not in the abuse itself, because again, God never authorizes abuse, but in your capacity to overcome it. Some people would have crumbled, some would have become bitter, or even passed that dysfunction on to others. But God saw that you could be the one to stand in the middle of emotional warfare and not become what tried to break you. You were chosen to stop the pattern, to expose the lie, and to come out with your heart still intact, even if bruised. Your empathy wasn't a weakness, it was your assignment. Your loyalty wasn't foolish, it was misused. And your ability to endure doesn't prove you were supposed to stay. It proves you were strong enough to leave. But before you left, or before you even realized the extent of the damage, you were already being chosen not as a recipient of harm, but as a vessel for revelation. There are moments in life when God positions us in uncomfortable, even painful places, not because he wants us to suffer, but because he knows we will see what others ignore. You were the one who could spot the manipulation. You were the one who could call it out, not always with words, but with presence, with silence, with boundaries, with your refusal to fully lose yourself to their false reality. You see, the enemy wants you to believe that your suffering invalidates your calling, that the narcissist's rejection is a reflection of your worth, that the pain is proof of your failure. But in reality, every time you kept loving despite not being loved back, every time you prayed through the gaslighting, every time you stayed soft in a hard environment, you were fulfilling a divine assignment that even you didn't fully understand. And the truth is, some people would never have changed, not even a little, if someone like you hadn't come into their lives. Even if they never admit it, even if they never thank you, your presence disrupted the narrative they were comfortable in. Narcissists thrive on control, but you were chosen to be the exception. The one person they couldn't completely own, couldn't fully deceive, couldn't silence forever. Narcissists thrive in darkness, not physical darkness, but emotional, spiritual, and psychological darkness. They operate in shadows, manipulating, deceiving, projecting, and distorting truth. Their world is often built on illusion, a grandiose self-image, a carefully curated persona, and a deep fear of exposure. Underneath the charm, charisma, or control lies a void, a lack of self-awareness, empathy, and authentic love. They surround themselves with people they can use, manipulate, or mirror, but not with people who truly reflect truth, because truth threatens the fragile identity they've constructed. And then there was you. You didn't come into their life by accident. You didn't show up merely as another source of admiration, another piece in their emotional puzzle. You brought something different. You brought light, a light they didn't expect, and if they were honest, couldn't handle. What do I mean by light? Light is clarity. Light is truth. Light is discernment. Light is conviction. Light is spiritual authority. You didn't need to quote scriptures or give lectures to bring this light. Your very presence, your compassion, your emotional availability, your capacity to love without manipulation was light. Your refusal to engage in chaos, your steady spirit, your deep intuition that something was off was light. Every time you confronted dishonesty without bitterness, set a boundary without malice, or forgave without enabling, you reflected a light that exposed their dysfunction. And make no mistake, light is confrontational even when it's gentle. To someone living in darkness, light is both attractive and terrifying. At first, narcissists may feel drawn to your brightness. They may admire your emotional intelligence, your grace, your strength. But over time, that same light begins to reveal the cracks in their facade. You start to ask questions they don't want to answer. You start to notice inconsistencies they thought they had hidden. You start to see past the mask, and that is when the resistance begins. Because your light doesn't just make you visible, it makes them visible too. They may try to dim your light through criticism, belittling, or gaslighting. They may project their insecurities onto you, accuse you of being too sensitive, too dramatic, or too much. But the truth is they saw in you what they feared in themselves. Authenticity, vulnerability, accountability. And that scared them because when you walk in the light, you invite others to do the same. And narcissists are rarely ready for that kind of transparency. What's ironic is that many narcissists believe they're the brightest in the room. They build their identity on being special, superior, or spiritually elevated, but their light is artificial. It's a spotlight, not a sunrise. It draws attention, but it doesn't bring warmth. It creates performance, not transformation. Your light, on the other hand, is not self-made. It's God-given. It doesn't shine for applause, but for healing. And sometimes simply being in their presence was a form of confrontation. You weren't trying to fight. You weren't trying to expose. But the truth in you stirred the truth in them, and that made them uncomfortable. They may have started to push you away, devalue you, or try to break you, not because you were weak, but because your strength challenged their false sense of control. This is what many people don't realize. Just because the narcissist tried to hurt you doesn't mean they weren't affected by you. In fact, the effort they put into manipulating or demeaning you is often a testament to how much your light disrupted their darkness. They didn't ignore you, they targeted you. Not because you were inferior, but because you were impactful. Your very presence threatened to unravel the identity they had spent years trying to protect. You became a mirror, not a distorted one like the people they usually surround themselves with, but a clear, honest reflection of what they refused to confront. You didn't play by their rules. You didn't orbit their ego. You didn't collapse under the weight of their emotional games. And even when you stumbled, even when you doubted yourself, your spirit kept shining quietly, consistently, and whether they acknowledged it or not, your light revealed something sacred, who they could be if they surrendered to truth, who they could become if they let God into the places they've sealed shut, who they could heal into if they laid down their pride. But that's a journey only they can choose to take. You were not responsible for their healing, but you were used divinely and powerfully as a beacon in their darkness, a living reminder that something better exists beyond manipulation, beyond fear, beyond control, a life rooted in love, humility, and accountability, a life in life. One of the most painful aftershocks of being in a relationship, romantic, familial, or otherwise, with a narcissist is the way it causes you to question your own kindness. You begin to see your compassion, your empathy, your soft heart as the very thing that led you into harm's way. You may have asked yourself, if I wasn't so understanding, maybe I wouldn't have been used. Or if I wasn't always forgiving, maybe I wouldn't have stayed so long. But let's confront that narrative with truth. Your compassion was never your weakness. It was your assignment. It wasn't your flaw. It was your calling. And while it may have been misunderstood, misused, and manipulated by the narcissist, God never saw it as a mistake. He saw it as a ministry. You were sent into their life with a divine attribute that narcissists rarely possess: empathy. And empathy isn't just a soft emotional trait, it's a spiritual gift. It gives you the ability to feel beyond the surface, to love past the defenses, to notice pain even when it's masked by pride. That's not foolishness. That's divine discernment dressed as tenderness. Let's be honest, most narcissists surround themselves with people who either feed their ego or fear their wrath. But then you came along not just to admire them, not just to affirm them, but to care genuinely, deeply, relationally. Your compassion wasn't performative, it was patient. You gave grace when it wasn't earned. You stayed when others would have run. You prayed when others would have cursed. That wasn't weakness, that was spiritual stamina. And while the narcissist may have mistaken your compassion for naivety, God saw it as evidence of your strength, because it takes far more courage to remain kind in the face of cruelty than it does to become cold. It takes spiritual maturity to extend love to someone who continues to build walls. It takes deep inner power to remain soft when the world keeps telling you to harden up. But here's the tension: compassion in the hands of a manipulator can feel like a liability. And that's the deception. The enemy wants you to believe that your softness is a flaw, that your ability to see the best in people, to hope for change, to believe in healing is the very thing that made you a target. But in truth, it's what made you dangerous to the enemy's agenda. Because compassion is not passive, it's powerful. It creates space for healing, reflection, and transformation. And that's exactly what darkness fears: transformation. The narcissist in your life wasn't ready to receive what you brought, but that doesn't mean your gift wasn't real. Sometimes God sends compassion not to fix a person, but to reveal them. You didn't walk into their life to be broken. You walked in to break the illusion. Your kindness showed them what authentic connection could look like. Your long-suffering love showed them what unconditional support feels like. Your steady spirit showed them what truth sounds like, even when spoken quietly. But because narcissists often reject what they can't control, they may have tried to twist your compassion into weakness. They may have called you too sensitive, too emotional, or too much. But what they really meant was, you feel things I don't want to feel. You care in ways I don't want to be accountable for. You love in a way I don't know how to receive. And so they pushed it away. But that rejection doesn't define your compassion. It highlights its impact. Your presence stirred something they weren't ready to confront. And that's how you know your compassion wasn't misplaced. It was divinely disruptive. Because when you walk into a space that's been ruled by selfishness, your unselfishness becomes revolutionary. When you offer connection in a place built on control, you threaten the entire foundation. When you give without agenda, forgive without manipulation, and show up without demanding praise, you become a living contradiction to everything a narcissist depends on to survive emotionally. And that contradiction wasn't a coincidence. It was an assignment. God placed that tender heart in your chest on purpose. He entrusted you with sensitivity, empathy, and compassion because he knew you wouldn't weaponize it. He knew you'd use it for healing, not harm. He knew that in the presence of emotional scarcity, you would be a well that doesn't run dry. Not because you're infinite, but because you're connected to him. And that assignment didn't end just because the narcissist couldn't receive it. In fact, the very resistance you faced might be confirmation that you were sent into the right place. Light doesn't always get applause when it shows up in darkness. It gets opposition. But that doesn't mean it wasn't needed. It doesn't mean it didn't make a difference. Even if the narcissist never changes, even if they never acknowledge the gift you were in their life, the assignment still mattered. Your compassion might not have changed them, but it revealed you. It revealed how deeply you can love, how bravely you can stand, how faithfully you can serve. It revealed that you carry something sacred, something disruptive, something that hell cannot counterfeit. If there's one message that's been deeply misunderstood, especially in spiritual circles, it's the idea that staying in a toxic situation equals strength, loyalty, or faithfulness. That somehow enduring abuse, manipulation, or chronic emotional chaos is a sign of spiritual maturity. That the longer you hold on, the more Chris-like you become. Let's be clear, leaving is not failure. It is wisdom. There is nothing holy about staying in dysfunction that is destroying your spirit. There is no spiritual badge for tolerating toxicity in the name of hope. There is no crown in heaven for enduring someone else's brokenness at the expense of your own wholeness. In fact, there comes a time when leaving is the most God-honoring, self-preserving, spiritually mature thing you can do. Not because you gave up, but because you woke up. And waking up to truth is never a failure. It's a breakthrough. Leaving a narcissist, whether it's a romantic partner, a parent, a boss, or even a church leader, often doesn't feel like victory in the beginning. It can feel like defeat, like disappointment, like deep aching grief. Why? Because you invested, you believed, you prayed, you gave them chance after chance, grace upon grace. You fought for the relationship longer than you should have because you saw something in them they didn't even see in themselves. You didn't walk away casually. You wrestled, you questioned, you cried. And yet you still left, or maybe you're thinking about leaving. Either way, let this truth settle deep in your soul. Choosing your peace, your health, and your healing is not a betrayal of faith. It is the fulfillment of it. There's a harmful lie that says real love never walks away. But let's look at Jesus. Jesus loved deeply. Jesus extended grace. Jesus pursued the lost, but he also walked away from people who rejected truth. He dusted his feet when towns didn't receive his message. He withdrew from toxic religious leaders who only sought to trap and twist his words. He loved fully, but he did not stay where his presence was constantly resisted, mocked, or manipulated. That is not failure. That is wisdom. And for you, leaving didn't mean you stopped caring. It didn't mean you stopped believing in the possibility of change. It meant that you finally accepted a painful but liberating truth. You can't heal someone who refuses to acknowledge they're wounded. You can't carry someone who weaponizes your support. You can't save someone who keeps pulling you underwater every time you reach out a hand. You were not created to be a martyr for someone else's brokenness. You are not the sacrificial lamb for someone else's ego. Jesus already did that. And when you choose to walk away, you are not abandoning your calling. You are aligning with it. Because the calling on your life will never require you to be diminished, abused, or erased in order to be fulfilled. Sometimes leaving isn't just wise, it's prophetic. It sends a clear message that dysfunction will no longer be coddled, that manipulation will no longer be normalized, that abuse, no matter how emotionally subtle or spiritually disguised, will no longer have a home in your life. You are drawing a line that says, I refuse to co-sign this broken narrative any longer. I am choosing truth, and I am choosing me. And it takes unbelievable courage to do that, especially when the narcissist has worked so hard to convince you that leaving them is cruel, selfish, or unjustified. Narcissists are masters of creating false guilt. They rewrite history, shift blame, and weaponize your empathy against you. They cry when you leave and mock you when you stay, and for a while, you may have lived in the fog of that emotional chaos, believing that walking away made you the problem. But clarity has a way of cutting through confusion. And wisdom, once you taste it, makes it impossible to return to willful blindness. Leaving might not have felt like winning at first. You may have felt empty. You may have doubted your decision. You may have second-guessed everything. But wisdom isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers, you did the right thing. Sometimes it speaks in the calm that returns to your soul after chaos has left the room. Sometimes it shows up in the mirror when you finally see yourself again, not as someone broken by love, but as someone strong enough to leave what was breaking you. And isn't that the paradox? That in walking away, you didn't lose. You reclaimed your identity. You reclaimed your worth. You reclaimed your boundaries. You reclaimed your voice. You reclaimed your connection to God, now unfiltered by manipulation. And that is not failure. That is wisdom wrapped in courage, shaped by grace and led by truth. Pain has a way of making us believe we've been abandoned, forgotten, or simply thrown into suffering for no reason, especially when that pain is caused by someone who claimed to love us, or worse, someone we love deeply. When you've experienced the confusing, relentless emotional trauma of dealing with a narcissist, your immediate reaction is often survival. You're just trying to make it through the day, make sense of the contradictions, navigate the gaslighting, and protect the pieces of your identity that still feel intact. In the middle of all that emotional warfare, the last thing that feels possible is believing there's purpose in what you're going through. And yet, purpose is often buried in the most painful places. Not in the moments of clarity, but in the chaos. Not in the victories, but in the valleys. Not when everything is going well, but when it all seems to be falling apart. That's where purpose is formed. Not because pain is the purpose, but because pain becomes the soil where divine purpose grows. When you were walking through the dysfunction, confusion, and rejection at the hands of the narcissist, you may not have seen any bigger picture, and that's okay. You weren't supposed to have perfect clarity while being emotionally dismantled. But now, as you begin to heal, reflect, and understand the magnitude of what you endured, you can begin to ask a sacred question. Not, why did this happen to me? But what is God doing through me even in this? See, pain may not be the teacher we choose, but it often teaches us more than comfort ever could. Pain teaches boundaries. It teaches discernment. It teaches how to depend on God when no one else understands. It teaches how to see truth clearly, even when lies are dressed in charm, flattery, or religious language. Pain develops strength that can't be faked. It refines character in the furnace of adversity. It deepens our empathy and expands our capacity to see and love others who are suffering. And when the pain is relational, when it comes from someone you let into the most intimate places of your heart, that kind of pain carves out space in you that nothing else can. It doesn't just change how you view others, it changes how you view yourself. It teaches you that you deserve to be heard, that your intuition isn't a mistake, that your discernment was warning you for a reason, that your heart is valuable and should never be handed over to someone who is incapable of stewarding it well. More than that, it teaches you how to see your story not as a series of failures, but as a map marked with the places you've grown, the battles you've survived, and the lessons you've earned. That map becomes part of your ministry, even if you never step onto a stage. Your story, the one filled with raw moments, heartbreak, confusion, and healing, becomes a lifeline for someone else walking through the same fire. Think about it. How would you know what manipulation looks like if you hadn't lived through it? How How would you be able to speak to someone else's brokenness with wisdom and grace if you hadn't seen it up close? How would you develop compassion for those stuck in cycles of emotional abuse unless you had been there yourself? The pain you endured equipped you with an authority you didn't ask for. But now, Carrie, God doesn't waste anything. Not a single tear, not a single sleepless night, not a single, I don't understand what's happening. Every moment of suffering becomes a seed. And over time, often silently beneath the surface, that seed starts to grow. You might not notice it at first. You might just feel more grounded, more aware, more anchored, but eventually you'll see it for what it is, evidence that your pain produced purpose. And what's even more profound is that the very thing the enemy used to try to destroy you, your tender heart, your trust, your willingness to see the best in someone, was not only preserved but strengthened. You may have walked through the fire, but you didn't come out smelling like smoke. You came out with fire in your bones, not bitterness in your spirit. And that's where purpose is forged, not in escaping pain, but in surviving it without losing your soul. In fact, many of the people God uses most powerfully are the ones who've suffered deeply. Not because he delights in their pain, but because he trusts them to find purpose in it. You didn't ask to be the one placed in the narcissist's life. You didn't ask to carry the emotional toll, the confusion, the betrayal. But you were chosen not because you were disposable, but because God knew you could come through it and carry something sacred on the other side. Purpose in pain doesn't always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes years, but that doesn't mean it isn't growing. Just like seeds planted in the ground, purpose works quietly, invisibly, beneath the surface. And eventually, you begin to notice it, not in dramatic revelations, but in the small ways your perspective shifts, in the way you talk to yourself with more kindness, in the way you recognize red flags earlier, in the way you're able to help someone else articulate what they're going through because you know that feeling. Not from theory, but from experience. You don't come out of that kind of pain the same, and that's the point. You come out wiser, sharper, more compassionate, more discerning, more rooted in your identity in God, not in what someone else tried to project onto you. That pain, it refined your purpose. It cleared out the noise. It clarified your calling. One of the cruelest tactics narcissistic abuse is isolation, not always physical, but emotional, psychological, and even spiritual. Narcissists are skilled at creating a world in which they are the center, you are the problem, and no one else could possibly understand what's really going on. Slowly, subtly, they chip away at your sense of connection to others. You begin to pull away from friends, stop confiding in family, and even question your own community because the narcissist has painted them as disloyal, unsupportive, or, to get you. Before you know it, you're in a space where your world feels very small and your pain feels uniquely yours. But here's the sacred truth that breaks through the fog of emotional manipulation. You are not alone. Not now, not ever. Your experience may feel personal, and it is. It's deeply personal, but it is not isolated. In fact, narcissistic abuse is more common than we often realize. It just hides behind masks. It masquerades as charisma, tough love, strong leadership, or passion. It shows up in romantic relationships, friendships, families, churches, workplaces, and even social causes. But because narcissists are masters at presenting a polished version of themselves to the outside world, the damage they cause often goes unnoticed, except by the person closest to them, you, and that's where the loneliness begins. You start to feel like you're the only one seeing the truth. You question whether you're exaggerating. You wonder if it's all in your head because no one else sees the side of them that you do. The silent manipulation, the gaslighting, the constant invalidation. And when you do try to speak up, sometimes others don't understand, or worse, they defend the narcissist. That response can be devastating. It adds another layer of betrayal. It makes you feel invisible, voiceless. But here's what the narcissist never counted on: the fact that there is a whole community of people, healing, wise, resilient people who have walked this same path, who see you, who understand, who carry the same battle scars. You are not the first person to love someone who emotionally drained you. You are not the first person to fall for potential while ignoring red flags. You are not the first person to question your sanity because of someone else's carefully constructed chaos. And you are certainly not the first person to find God in the middle of the confusion, asking, is this what love is supposed to feel like? There is strength in knowing that your pain has echoes in the hearts of others who have survived it too. Your voice may have been silenced for a season, but it is not gone. And as you begin to speak, you will hear the voices of others saying, me too. I thought I was the only one. I've been there. I understand. And there's something powerful that happens when you realize you're not crazy, you're not too sensitive, you're not making it up. You're just healing from something that was designed to be hidden. Healing is never a solo project. It may start with personal decisions, but it is sustained by community, even if that community is small at first, even if it's just one other person who truly sees you, one book that validates your experience, one counselor who finally gives language to what you've been going through, one moment in prayer when God reminds you, I saw it all. You weren't imagining any of it, and I'm still here. Even in scripture, we see that God never intended for healing to happen in isolation. Time and again, the Bible speaks of fellowship, shared burdens, confession, encouragement. In Galatians 6:92, we are told to carry each other's burdens. Why? Because God knows how heavy some of them are, especially the invisible ones, especially the burdens that no one else understands until they've carried them too. And let's not forget that Jesus himself was misunderstood, falsely accused, and betrayed by those closest to him. He knows what it feels like to be surrounded by people who see only what they want to see. He knows what it's like to be judged unjustly, to speak truth and have it twisted, to give love and have it rejected. So when you cry out and feel like no one else understands, he does, fully, intimately. There's something sacred about knowing you're not the only one. It gives your journey context. It gives your healing traction. It lets you breathe again. Because when you've lived under emotional manipulation for so long, even breathing feels like rebellion. Even resting feels unfamiliar. But slowly, steadily, as you encounter others who have walked through the same valley, you begin to reclaim your sense of belonging, your sense of normalcy, your sense of self. And beyond the comfort of shared experience, there's also a greater truth at work. You are not alone spiritually, not for a single second. Even in the loneliest moments, when the narcissist made you feel like no one would ever love you the way they did, when they isolated you from those who truly cared, when they punished your independence and shamed your boundaries, God was there, not passively watching, but actively preserving, guiding, protecting, speaking truth into your soul even when no one else was. You may not have realized it at the time. You may have felt spiritually numb, but he never left, not when you stayed too long. Not when you didn't recognize the abuse, not when you blamed yourself. His presence was constant, even in your confusion. And now, as you step into clarity and healing, he is bringing you into spaces where you can connect, relate, and finally exhale, because healing doesn't happen in echo chambers. It happens in spaces where your pain is named, validated, and held with grace. You were never meant to do this alone. You are part of a larger story, one woven through the lives of people who have survived, overcome, and emerge stronger from the very same darkness you once walked through. When you've been in the grip of a narcissistic relationship, the losses are not always visible at first. You may not have bruises on your skin, but the wounds run deep, spiritual, emotional, mental, and even physical. Over time, the narcissist doesn't just take up space in your life, they begin to extract things from your soul. Little by little, they chip away at your identity, your confidence, your clarity, your joy. They drain you, confuse you, strip you of your voice, and you're left wondering, will I ever get back what I lost? Will I ever feel whole again? And the truth is, you might not even be able to articulate everything that was taken from you right away. The damage is subtle but severe. Maybe it was your sense of peace, once steady, now replaced by walking on eggshells. Maybe it was your ability to trust your own judgment, gaslighted so many times that you began to question your every thought. Maybe it was time, years, even decades given to someone who only took and never truly gave. Or maybe it was something even more sacred, your faith. Your sense of connection to God, distorted by someone who used spiritual language to justify emotional control. But here's the divine promise that no narcissist, no manipulator, no abuser can ever revoke. God will restore, wasn't just redeem stories. He rebuilds souls. Restoration is one of the most beautiful and repeated themes throughout Scripture. In Joel 20:25, God says, I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten. Think about that, the years, not just the moments or the resources or the relationships, but the years. The time you thought was wasted, the seasons where you were silenced, forgotten, and depleted, the years spent trying to fix someone who refused to change. God does not ignore that loss. He sees it, records it, and makes it part of his redemptive blueprint for your life, because that's the nature of God. He is a restorer by design. He doesn't leave you with just survival. He moves you into wholeness, into overflow, into newness. But restoration isn't always immediate. It often happens gradually, like a sunrise after a long night, one glimmer at a time. You start noticing you're not as anxious. You laugh without guilt. You pray without fear. You make decisions without second-guessing yourself. You begin to feel like yourself again. Or maybe, for the first time, you finally meet the version of you that the narcissist tried to bury. But let's not oversimplify it. Restoration isn't just about feeling better. It's a sacred reclamation. God is not simply giving back what the narcissist stole. He is redefining what you thought you lost. You may have thought your voice was gone forever, but God is giving it back stronger. You may have thought your hope was shattered, but he's replacing it with unshakable faith. You may have believed love was something you had to earn, but now you're learning that real love is freely given and grounded in truth. You may have thought the damage was permanent, but God is proving that nothing is beyond his power to restore. And what's even more miraculous is that God doesn't just restore to the level you were before the damage. He restores beyond. He multiplies. He elevates. He uses the pain as fertilizer for deeper purpose. Where the narcissists sowed confusion, God plants clarity. Where they created fear, God builds courage. Where they tore down your worth, God rebuilds your identity on his truth, not their lies. Restoration also means reclaiming time and opportunities that seemed lost. For every door the narcissist closed out of jealousy, control, or fear, God is preparing new doors, better ones. You may feel like you're starting over, but in reality, you're moving forward from a deeper place of wisdom, awareness, and power. This isn't a setback, it's a setup for something new. And perhaps most healing of all, God begins to restore your ability to love again, not just others, but yourself. After narcissistic abuse, self-love can feel foreign, even wrong. You've been taught to center someone else's needs, moods, and approval for so long that thinking of yourself feels selfish. But restoration teaches you that love without boundaries isn't love at all, it's bondage. You begin to see that taking care of your soul is not rebellion, it's obedience. And slowly, tenderly, God walks you back into yourself, showing you that what was taken didn't define you, what's being restored will. And in that process, you may find yourself mourning who you could have been without the pain, mourning the innocence lost, mourning the time wasted, and that's okay. God honors grief, but even as you grieve, he is already working, already rebuilding, already restoring in ways you may not yet see, but will soon live. You may not feel it yet. You may still be exhausted. You may still be healing from the invisible scars. But restoration isn't based on feelings, it's based on God's faithfulness. If he promised to restore, then restoration is not a possibility, it is a certainty. It's not a matter of if, but when. And when it comes, it won't be subtle, it will be transformative. It will be the kind of restoration that leaves no doubt it was God who did it. So if you're standing here today, bruised but breathing, weary but wiser, know this: you didn't just survive that relationship, you outgrew it. You didn't lose your worth, you reclaimed it. And what felt like punishment was actually positioning, strategic, sacred, sovereign. God didn't send the narcissist into your life to destroy you. He allowed it to expose you to yourself, to them, to your purpose. He used what was meant to break you to build you. He allowed the darkness not to consume you, but to reveal the power of the light you carry. Your story isn't over. In fact, it's just beginning. The pain you endured, the wisdom you've gained, and the healing you're walking in, it all matters. Not just for you, but for the people who will need your voice, your experience, your courage. What tried to silence you only prepared you to speak louder. What tried to erase you only made your identity clearer. So walk forward, not in shame, but in strength, not in fear, but in freedom. You weren't punished, you were positioned. And now you are rising, not as a victim of someone else's dysfunction, but as a living testimony of God's redemption. You are not broken, you are chosen. You are not behind, you are becoming. And everything that was taken, God will restore.